I don't mind doing a question answer. I haven't studied Islamic law, so I don't know in terms of the legal aspect of it, how beneficial I'll be. What I will say is this. From all the answers I've heard, I think it's clear to say that we don't really know what we're doing sometimes. And that's exactly what a dilemma is. A dilemma is when there's a lot of gray area and we don't really know what to do. So what do we do? What I think we need is what I've written down as a case-by-case morality. And what I want to talk about today, I've been given 10 or 15 minutes or so, and what I want to talk about is how, from an Islamic perspective, and this is just one perspective, there are many, how from an Islamic perspective you can come to a place wherein you can make case-by-case decisions. And so in different cases, for example, in the case of pulling the plug, in one case, the exact same scenario might be the right thing to do, and in another case, that exact same scenario might be the wrong thing to do. And we can come to a place where we know what is right for us as individuals, what the right course of action is, even though everything else has remained the same. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So, for example, I can't read my own writing. So for example, when we talk about pulling the plug, there are some cases the doctor says he has 1 or 2 years to live, but there are some cases where they do recover. You don't have this knowledge, correct? And there is a place where you can come to where you might be able to have that knowledge. And that's what I want to talk about today. So what I'll start by doing is I'm going to talk about some popular ethical theories that are kind of in fashion or in vogue right now in ethical philosophy. And then I want to relate those theories to look at what the Quran has to say about them. And then in the end, I want to talk about one theory in particular, which I believe will allow us to make this case-by-case decision when we're facing moral and ethical dilemmas which don't have a clear answer and depend really on the situation. So if you'll indulge me for 10 or 12 minutes, and if we do have time after that, I would be more than willing to take some questions. Again, I can't promise any answers, but I'll do my best. So since the 20th century, 3 ethical theories, 3 of them have been dominating the field of moral philosophy. The name of these 3 theories are consequentialism, deontology, and virtue ethics. And again, as I said, I want to see what the Quran has to say about these 3 theories. And I want to argue that virtue ethics is the way, and the most important of these when we're dealing with moral dilemmas. It is a way for us to have a sort of divine inner wisdom or guide to tell us what to do when we don't know what to do. Does that make sense? Yeah? We're all on the same page? Yeah? Okay. So, as I mentioned, the first theory of ethics is called consequentialism. And the most famous offshoot of consequentialism is called utilitarianism. I think you've probably heard of this. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, I don't know if you've heard these names, they're quite famous. Anyway, utilitarianism, simply put, is the idea that you only have to think about one thing when you're making an ethical decision. And that one thing is the consequences of your actions. That's the only determination. What consequences will it produce? So utilitarianism is the idea that the ethical action is an action that will produce the most amount of utility or good for the most amount of people. Clear? Simple enough? Yeah? Okay. So to some extent, the Quran does seem to share this view. So for example, I'm going to quote verse in Surah Baqarah 2:19. It says, "They ask you concerning wine and gambling, say, in them is a great harm and some benefit for men. But the harm is greater than the benefit." And I'll leave the rest of the verse. So you see here that the Quran is telling the Prophet to tell the people that drinking and wine have both benefits and drawbacks, but the drawbacks are greater, so consequences, so don't do it. Right? So it's utilitarian in that sense. Therefore, it is important for us to consider the consequences of our actions whenever we're dealing with a moral dilemma. However, what if you're facing a dilemma and you don't know what all the possible consequences are? You've all heard of the butterfly effect? That, you know, a butterfly flapping its wings on one side of the world could cause this phenomenon on the other side of the world. It's very hard to know all the consequences of our actions, is what I'm trying to say. What if you do know all the consequences of your actions? How would you measure goodness? What's better, it would be very hard to measure. Or what if the consequences of your action benefit the majority of people but hurt a minority of them, right? So this is the kind of problems that consequentialism and utilitarianism face in general. Fortunately, despite the verse I just quoted, the Quran's understanding of morality is not rooted in utilitarian calculations. Rather, it seems to be rooted in two other sources. These are divine revelation and the human self. Okay? The idea of divine revelation as a source for ethics leads us to the second theory of morality that I wanted to discuss very briefly. And that is called deontology. Okay? Deontology is based on two concepts. The first concept is that you should act rightly regardless of any consequences. It's your moral duty. Okay? And the second idea is that humans should act, the right action is determined by a single rule or a set of rules. Okay? Now the two very famous examples of a single rule are the golden rule, right? Do unto others as you would want others to do unto you. We have this in Islam too. There's a hadith from the Prophet that says, none of you are true believers until you wish for your brother what you wish for yourself, if you've heard this hadith. A second famous one rule is Kant's categorical, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, his categorical imperative, ethical imperative, which is that treat every action as if your action will become universal law, right? So this is a standard to judge, right? And it sounds like a very good theory, but it also has its problems. Now, I'm not going to get into the problems into those problems right now. Historically, it is deontology in the form of divine command theory. So deontology is the main branch, right? So, and then there's different branches and offshoots. One of these offshoots is called divine command theory. And it is divine command theory that has dominated the field of Islamic ethics and law. Divine command theory is the idea that God, in His infinite wisdom, knows what is best for us. Therefore, acting ethically is following God's will as revealed in the Quran and by extension the teachings of the prophets and the imams. This view is supported by the Quran since it clearly lays down some of God's laws and even speaks about the limits of God's law, which are known as hududullah. To provide a couple of examples, in chapter 2, verse 216, it says, fighting is prescribed for you and you dislike it, but it's possible that you dislike a thing which is good for you and that you love a thing which is bad for you, but Allah knows and you know not. In chapter 6, verse 50, it says, Muhammad, tell them, I do not claim to have all the treasures of God in my hands, nor to know the unseen, nor do I claim to be an angel. I follow only what is revealed to me from God. Say to them, are the blind and the seeing equal? Why then do you not think? Okay, so there's this idea that God knows, and we should follow that. Thus, it is always essential to look at the Quran and the teachings of the prophets and imams when we are facing ethical dilemmas. However, what happens when there's no clear answer in the revealed sources? Or what if there is a clear answer, but it is no longer possible or desirable to implement it? In other words, how do we discern the Quran's absolute and moral guidelines and then apply them to our own relative circumstances, our own moral dilemmas? These are questions that the early Muslim community was facing as Islam began to expand. The Islamic legal scholars, or fuqaha, developed methodologies to interpret the sources and provide people with answers. However, sometimes we find these answers to be problematic. Correct? Yeah? This feels like a speech to me now. I didn't want it to be a speech. Yeah? Agreed or disagreed? Yeah? Okay. As Dr. Takim correctly pointed out, for those of you who are here, revelation and our understanding of revelation are two different things. Right? So we don't agree with some of the understandings of revelation. And these are two different things. Nevertheless, and here perhaps Dr. Takim decided to not talk about, he's limited in his time, so I don't know if we agree or disagree. I'll find out when he writes his book, and inshallah I'll get a chance to read it. But nevertheless, it is extremely important to remember that there are different degrees and levels of understanding. Okay, so it's not just that everyone has their understanding, it's just a bunch of understandings that are all the same. Right? The Prophet's understanding, we would say, was at a higher level. right? He transcended some of the context and received some knowledge that was beyond that. And the Quran is clear that not all understandings are equal. For example, in, again, chapter 2 and verse 269, the Quran says, He gives wisdom to whom He wills, and whoever has been given wisdom has certainly been given much good, and none will remember except those of understanding. Certainly, a wise person's understanding of the Quran is better than an ignorant person's understanding of the Quran. I think you'd agree with that. If not, then I don't know. You know the issue. This leads me to the idea of virtue ethics, and that's the third one I want to talk about, and I think it's the most important one for what we are doing today and in terms of moral and ethical dilemmas, virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is not concerned with determining the right course of action in any given situation. It doesn't care. Instead, virtue ethics argues that morality should be focused on cultivating virtues within human beings. This is because the actions of a good person naturally become good actions, and the actions of a bad person naturally flow out bad actions. In other words, right action comes from virtue and not the other way around. However, and I'll just mention this, however, on the highest level, virtue encompasses action and the two cannot be separated. Okay? We're not going to get too deep into that. Anyway, in any case, the Quran also seems to emphasize the principal primacy, okay, so the principal primacy of being good over doing good. Okay? The primacy of being good over doing good. So just to quote a couple of verses. Okay? Dr. Takim did mention this verse in chapter 49, verse 14, when the Arabs come to the Prophet and they tell them, we believe. And then God tells the Prophet to tell the Arabs, tell them, you don't believe, but rather say, we submit, for faith has not yet entered your hearts. Yet, if you obey Allah, and I won't finish the verse. So here, they're coming and they're saying, we are mu'mins, meaning we're in a state of belief, right? Whereas the Prophet says, no, you are Muslims, you are doing Islam, right? As Dr. Takim said, you do Islam. So the Islam is acting, whereas Iman is a state of being, a state of faith, okay? In another verse, 33:5, there is no blame on you if you make a mistake therein. What counts is the intention of your hearts, okay? So we're talking about intention. And then when, in talking about the Day of Judgment, this is the last verse for this, I'll say chapter 26, verse 88 and 89. That day whereon neither wealth nor sons will avail, but only he will prosper that brings Allah a sound heart. Okay? A sound heart again refers to being good, not doing good. Okay? Now, of course, as I said, they work together. So I'm not trying to separate them, but I'm trying to put the principal primacy on one of them. Okay? Similarly, we see the same thing in the teachings of Imam Ali. In Najr al-Balagha, for example, he says, a virtuous person is better than virtue, and a vicious person is worse than vice. Worse than the vice. Similarly, he also says, the sin which makes you sad and repentant is more liked by Allah than the good deed which makes you arrogant. Okay? These verses in the Hadith show that the Quran places primacy on the state of a person's being over their doing and acting. Our sources seem to tell us that the most important aspect of good actions is that it is transformative. That is, it cultivates virtue within human beings. Therefore, from this point of view, it is clear that any Islamic theory of ethics must be grounded in the concept of virtuous transformation. Now, there are many virtues, and there's no way I could cover even any of them. Aristotle grouped them, I think, into the 4 cardinal virtues. Some Islamic scholars today group them into 3. Under these 3 or 4, there's 50, 60, 70, I don't know. But there are a lot. Now, there are many virtues, but in line with today's topic, I'm only going to talk briefly about one of them, and that is the virtue of wisdom. Right? We need wisdom to deal with dilemmas, ethical, moral, other stuff. Yeah, agreed? Yeah. When I teach my classes, I'm used to them always like nodding to me or doing something to just show me they're on the same page. Anyway, we can say that wisdom is the ability to discern the truth, and justice is the ability to put things in the correct place according to that truth. Has everyone got that? Wisdom is the ability to discern the truth, and justice is the ability to put things in the correct place according to that truth. Therefore, it is necessary to have wisdom when you are facing an ethical dilemma. This is because wisdom, in conjunction with revelation, so I'm not separating revealed law with virtue ethics. They work together hand in hand, in fact. They allow you to understand how to implement revealed law. Okay? So they're not separate at all. This is because wisdom in conjunction with revelation will allow you to know what is right and how to correspond accordingly, meaning how to act in that ethical dilemma. Now, a lot of us seem to believe that wisdom is rooted in the mind's ability to reason. Okay? Now, I know this is not accurate, simply put. Wisdom is supra-rational. That means it is above and greater than reason. According to the Quran, wisdom comes from what we can refer to as the knowledge of the inner heart. For example, according to the Quran, in chapter 22, verse 46, the Quran says, "It is not the eyes that are blind, but the hearts in their breasts." Another verse, chapter 64, verse 11 says, "And whosoever believes in God, God guides his heart, and God is the knower of all things." According to the famous Islamic poet, Rumi, he says, "If knowledge of mysteries come after emptiness of mind, that is illumination of the heart." He also says, "That which is false troubles the heart, but truth brings a joyous tranquility." Okay? And the Quran is full of this in terms of the heart, and so are the hadith, and I don't want to quote everything. Anyway, therefore, the most important thing one can do is bring their inner heart to life. When the inner heart comes alive, it is able to receive wisdom and know what is best for the self, as well as the correct action to take in any particular situation. In other words, it is the knowledge of the inner heart, along with revealed guidance, that allows us to solve dilemmas which have no clear answers. Now, there's a lot to say about the different ways in which we can transform ourselves and bring the inner heart to life. Unfortunately, we don't have the time, and I hope in the future we can speak on this topic, inshallah. Oil organizers, yes, inshallah. For now, I will conclude with an interesting example of transformative ethics in the Quran's narrative about the meeting between Moses and Khidr. Okay. According to this narrative, Khidr was a chosen servant of God who was blessed with knowledge of the heart. Wanting to learn from him, Moses asked, "May I follow you on the footing that you teach me something of the higher truth that you have been taught?" Khidr was hesitant and responded, "Verily, you will not be able to have patience with me. And how can you have patience about things about which your understanding is not complete?" Upon hearing this, Moses promised to be patient. This is a prophet. We're not very patient. And I find this humility here pretty telling for us to learn from. Anyway, Moses promised to be patient, obedient, and accept Khidr's actions without question or objections. Nevertheless, on 3 different occasions, Moses, by virtue of his ethical character, was unable to stay silent. Hence, Khidr told his companion, "This is the parting between me and you. Now I will tell you the interpretation of those things over which you were unable to hold your patience." Khidr explained that despite outward appearances, the inward or unseen reality of his actions were good and therefore in accordance with God's will. In the context of this narrative, then, Moses represents a tradition of deontological ethics, and Khidr represents the tradition of virtue ethics. Khidr, a transformed soul, was able to discern right from wrong using his inward microcosmic divine guide, the inner heart. This is not to say that Moses was not a transformed soul. This is very important here, and this is my ending. This is not to say that Moses was not a transformed soul. In fact, he was. What this narrative tells us is that when you reach a certain level of transformation, God is able to give you the knowledge that you need in relation to your own self and your own circumstances. And so the knowledge that was given to Nabi Musa was for his situation, his circumstances, and his mission. And that what was given to Khidr was for his situation, his circumstances, and his mission. And for all of us, we have the ability to put ourselves in a state that when we are facing a moral and ethical dilemma, there is something within us. Now, we talk about fitrah a lot, and that being our conscious and that inner guide. But the fitrah, as we have been taught, gets covered up a lot. It gets darkened, it gets dormant. And sometimes what we think is fitrah is actually just our emotions, and we are very much manipulated by society, for example, to tell us what to feel good about or bad about, as one example, or religiously, by our religious leaders, what to feel good or bad about. And so what you think is fitrah might not really be fitrah. What I'm trying to say is that we all have to go through a cleansing to bring our fitrah to life. And by doing so, we would be able to receive the guidance we need when we're facing particular ethical dilemmas that have no clear answers. Thank you so much for your patience. I really appreciate it. I hope you benefited from that. I don't know if we have time for questions and answers, but I'll be free to take them.
We have about 8 minutes until Salah time. So are there any questions? I'll come by with the mic. You guys will first.
I have been transformed by 3 books recently. I've read 3 books and I think I've been transformed completely by it. One is by Novel Harari. It's called Sapiens. The second one is called Origin by Dan Brown. He's a very famous author. And the third one is what I'm reading now. It's a huge, thick book. It's called How Not to Die. I know it's funny, but it's got some good points in there.
Who's the author?
The author is Michael Greger, Dr. Michael Greger. He gives his points he says, these are evidence-based points. Now, let's start with the first one, Harari guy. Harari says that our AI, what is it?
Artificial intelligence.
Artificial intelligence, yeah. Artificial intelligence, the technology has improved and is still improving so high, so fast. And our medical information technology is also improving very, very fast. And when the two meet, he says it wouldn't be surprising that one day we can live up to 500 years. That's why I'm saving my $28 million in the TD bank. I'm not giving it away. Not even to you, Saira.
I don't know, you want to live 500 years?
No, he says that somebody asked the same question. Who would want to live for 500 years? Because the skin would be drooling and all those things. He says, no, everything will be changeable at that time. Including your skin, your appearance and everything. You look, he says, look at the mirror and imagine what you look like when you are 20 years old. And that's what you can look like by the technology. Okay, so that's Harari. Now, Michael Greger, I'm skipping the middle one because I don't remember what he said. But Michael Greger, he says that if you change completely from an animal-based protein to a plant-based protein, he says that we can definitely reverse all the killers that are killing us now. And he gives the example of his grandmother, who was 75 or 76 years old. And she has been turned back from the hospitals because she had gone there to the hospital so many times for a heart transplant, not heart transplant, but what do you call it, bypass, heart bypass. Until the last time she goes there, the doctor said, look, we're running out of plumbing in you. We don't have the pipes anymore to use. So you better go home and call it a day, you know. So the lady goes home, and that same time, 60 Minutes, a serious program, happened to be airing, a program that said that there's a doctor in the West Coast in LA who has opened a heart recovery clinic. So she treks all the way 3,000 miles to the West Coast and joins them. And she's on a wheelchair, by the way, at that time, 76 years old. Now she goes to the clinic and she stays there for 21 days or 22 days, and she walks out. She doesn't use the wheelchair anymore. She walks out and she starts running 10 miles a day. And she lives to 96 years old before she dies. And her heart disease was not only treated, but it was reversed. So Greger says that heart disease and many killers, like what do you call this? The chest disease, you know, all these things can be reversed, although now they are thought of as incurable. So going to the question of pulling the plugs, would you pull the plug if you know that you're going to live for 500 years, that there is a hope?
I wouldn't want to live for 500 years. There's a famous hadith that says, the world is a prison for the believer. I would look forward to, I hope, inshallah, returning to that divine presence as opposed to being separated, but that's me. So I wouldn't want to live 500 years, personally.
I would save my money and keep stay for 500 years.
No, by all means then, by all means.
Thank you. Okay.
Dr. Jaffer.
Where am I looking? Sorry.
I need to wrap my mind around something you said earlier on about the primacy, where the Quran emphasized the primacy of being good versus doing good.
Yes.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around that, because just bear with me very quickly. If I go with a bunch of volunteers and go and help some Syrian refugees, let's say, for example, to settle into Canada, I'm potentially doing good.
Yes.
Aren't I being good at the same time? Why would we distinguish between the two, is what I'm trying to wrap my mind around. Because by the act of doing good, you are being good. At least that's, the logic tells me that. So can you help me wrap my mind around what you're saying?
Sure. So the title of my work was Traditional Islamic Ethics, the Concept of Virtue and Implications for Human Rights. I took about 50 pages and I condensed them into 4. So some of these more interesting things I can't really get into, but it's a very important distinction, very important. And I'll go back to this verse where, or Dr. Takim's lectures, where he talks about Islam as an act and Iman as a state of being. Now, you might do good, correct? But it does not necessarily, it won't necessarily lead to you being good. In other words, what are your intentions and motives behind your action? In fact, your doing good can in fact lead to you being bad. Correct? Now, what I'm saying is, in principle, so not necessarily in action or in reality, like in everyday life, but in principle, being is primary, acting is secondary. However, in reality, they work together. When you do good, you become better. And when you become better, you do more good. So they're self-reflexive. But it's important to note that in principle, one is primary, one does come first. In the sense of, at the end of the day, it is the state of being you are in that is of utmost importance. And from there, good actions will flow. But again, as I said, as I quoted the verse, when God, on the day of judgment, God is looking for a person with a sound heart. Or the verse when the Arabs say, we come, we're doing good, meaning they're following Islam. They're paying the sadaqah, the zakat, they're fasting. And still the Prophet said, no, don't say that. Don't say you have a state of faith. Just say you're doing good. Because the faith has not entered your heart yet. If you continue, then perhaps it will enter your heart. And so the Quran also says Iman is of a higher state than Islam. And so I'll just put this hadith out there. I don't know how popular it is, if it exists in Shia, the corpus, but it doesn't matter because it's universal. But I know it exists in the Sunni corpus of hadith, that the angel came to the companions of the Prophet, and he's explaining the stages of faith. And Iman was at the highest level. And he said Iman is, essentially what he said was, explained faith, that Iman was taqwa, or God consciousness, to be in that state. Not of any action, but to be in that state.